What's going on, everybody? It's Joel here, and today we're taking a look at the Luxiaojun M1 Mastery Training Barbell. Alright, so not too long ago I reviewed the E1 Barbell from Luxiaojun, and I really liked it. I thought, and I still think, that is probably the best bar that you can buy for the money. It's $215 shipped. It has a 28mm diameter shaft. It's got a 200K PSI tensile strength, 8 bearings. It spins really fast. The knurling is comfortable. I personally like it, but I think that's probably the most polarizing feature of that barbell, because it can be a little bit on the light side if you like a more aggressive cut of knurling. And then the whip is pretty good for a barbell in that price range. It's not the best in the world, but it's definitely not the stiffest bar that I've ever used. It should suffice most of the people that are shopping in that price range of barbells. So when the M1 barbell came out, I was a little bit confused because it has a lot of the same specifications as the E1 barbell. It still has that black chrome coating, though the black chrome on the M1 barbell is a little bit more matte. It's less slippery, and I definitely prefer that. The sleeves have a QPQ coating on them, which is okay. I don't really think that's like a selling feature, because it does show wear pretty quickly in comparison to the black chrome. The sleeves still have 8 bearings in total, so there's going to be 4 bearings in each sleeve. So that on paper doesn't look very different, but when you actually start using the barbell, you will notice a difference in the way that the bar spins. The M1 bar has a more controlled, it's a little bit slower controlled spin, but I personally prefer it because I did think that the E1, while it did have amazingly fast spin, it wasn't the most controlled, so it could over-rotate on you. The tensile strength of both barbells is still that 200K PSI tensile strength, though initially I did think that the M1 felt a lot more stiff than the E1, and I'll get back to that in just a minute. And then the knurling on the M1 is supposed to be a little bit deeper than on the E1. It is, but it's hardly noticeable. And then finally, the only real big difference between the E1 and the M1 barbells is that the M1 has this flange to the sleeve shoulder, which definitely looks cool, but I wouldn't really consider that to be like a selling feature of the barbell. It just basically stops the barbell from rolling around if it's just laid down by itself. But like I said, that's not really something that I would consider a main selling feature, especially considering the price difference between the E1, which is $215, and the M1, which is $300. So initially, I was pretty underwhelmed when I got the M1 barbell. I was expecting a much more aggressive knurling, and I really didn't notice too much of a difference at all. The difference that I can tell you is that the M1 does have a deeper cut, a very slightly deeper cut of knurling, but when compared to the E1, it has less like knurl marks per square inch, I guess, if you want to like quantify it like that. The E1 has more fine knurling, it has more of it, and the M1 has a little bit of a deeper cut, but it has less cross hatches per like square inch. Either way, I personally like the knurling on both of the barbells. I don't really like aggressive cut knurling, and I think the M1 feels really nice in the hand, though I still think I prefer the E1 barbell just because it's a little bit more fine. It's actually a little bit more scratchy feeling in comparison to the M1, and I feel like that grips a little bit easier than the M1 knurling does. Now, even though there isn't a real big difference in the feel of the knurling between the M1 and the E1, the knurling cut is excellent on the M1 barbell. It is very neat and uniform all throughout the barbell. It gives it a really nice feel. The start and stop points on the dual markings are also very cleanly cut. You do have an IPF and an IWF marking. I personally think that this barbell should have just had the weightlifting mark, but it doesn't really bother me that much that it has the powerlifting mark. And then the knurling is pretty much cut all the way out to the sleeve. There's virtually no space between the knurling and the sleeve shoulders. So if you have a really wide snatch grip, you're gonna like that about this barbell. When it comes to the thickness of the shaft, I measured the M1 at pretty much a perfect 28 millimeters. It was like 28.02 millimeters. So I'm gonna say that that is right on the money, which I really like. So now going back to the spin of this barbell. Like I mentioned earlier, the M1 does not spin as fast or as freely as the E1 barbell. Some people are going to not like that, but I personally prefer it because I thought that the E1 spun a little bit too freely. Sometimes it would want to over rotate on you when you're doing snatches, and I personally did not like that about that barbell. What I think that that bar would excel for is like CrossFit workouts where you're not necessarily putting up all that much weight. And I think the M1 barbell would be a better bar for just like Olympic weightlifting training when you're more focused on the accuracy of your lifts. This bar still spins very well, don't get me wrong. I've had no issues getting under any of my lifts with the M1 barbell, and I still think that this bar spins very well, though it's just not as fast as the E1. So initially when I got the M1 barbell in, I thought it was a little bit on the stiff side. It still has a 200 psi tensile strength, but I think that the yield strength is probably a little bit higher. There's something about this barbell that makes it feel a little bit more stiff than the E1 barbell, which wasn't the greatest whipping bars, but I mean, for the money, it was pretty good, and I think it should suffice most of the people using it. Though, when I started throwing on more weight onto the M1 barbell, I started noticing that it was a lot better than the E1 barbell was. The whip on this bar is much better, but it's not really noticeable until you're over about 225 pounds or so. So if you're a more novice lifter, I'd still probably go with the E1 over the M1. Also, if you're doing like CrossFit, I'd still probably go with the E1 over the M1. But if you are looking for a good training barbell and you plan to put up heavier weights, you're an intermediate to, I mean, elite weightlifter if you want to go for a bar like this, I think that the M1 is the better barbell in terms of the whip of the barbell. Okay, so the M1 retails for $300, the E1 retails for $215. So who would I recommend the M1 for compared to the E1? The M1 would be better suited for someone that is going to be lifting heavier loads, just in general. I think that this is the more accurate bar in terms of the way that it spins. I think that the whip is better, but it only really comes into play if you're lifting heavier loads. And then the knurling, I mean, the knurling is kind of a wash between both of them, but I do like the fact that the coating on this barbell is a little bit more on the matte side. I do think that they should have included some center knurling with the M1 bar, but I mean, it's not that big a deal. The E1 is probably better suited for someone looking for a CrossFit bar, someone that's not really looking to lift heavier loads, though I still think that that bar is still fine for some of the heavier stuff. It's just not as good as the M1 bar is. The one weak spot on pretty much all of Luxiaojun's stuff is that they have a pretty limited warranty. The warranty on the M1 barbell is 2 years. I don't expect to break this bar. It has absolutely no issues with like deformity. I haven't been babying this at all, and it's still in really good condition. The QPQ coating on the sleeves is not the greatest. Like I said, it shows wear almost immediately, but otherwise the finish on the barbell is still very good. The black chrome coating doesn't chip off that easily like when you rack it, and I think overall this is a well-built barbell, and I don't expect it to break down on you anytime soon. Okay, so if you were to ask me to choose between the M1 and the E1 barbells, I would personally choose the M1. I think the increase in price is justified. The spin is better in my opinion. I think the controlled spin is better than the really fast spin. The knurling is a wash between the two. The build quality of the M1 is indeed better than the E1. There's less play in the sleeve. The coating on the M1 is also better. I prefer the more matte coating to the more glossy coating. And overall, I would prefer using the M1. But that doesn't mean the E1 doesn't have its place. I still think that all things considered, it's probably the better bar for the money. It's a better CrossFit bar. I think it's gonna suffice most people as far as weightlifting goes. And I think for the majority of users out there, the E1 is still probably the better choice. So if you guys have any questions about the M1, the E1, pretty much anything from Luxiaojun, feel free to leave them in the comment section. If you guys want to pick up your M1 barbell, I'll leave a link in the description so that you can buy that. If you use my links, I get a little kickback, so it helps support the channel if you wanted to do so. Make sure that you guys hit that subscribe button and that like button if you find that this video was useful. And as always, guys, thanks for watching.